Thanks. Okay. So now what I will do is I will share my screen with you. And so here we are. We're looking at a non-existent book called Learning from Our Mistakes, Epistemology for the Real World. And it's a book in which I certainly don't do the whole history of Western epistemology, but the story of Western epistemology is a big part of it. And, uh, and of course, anybody who tries to do the story of the Western epistemology is going to make lots of mistakes. So that's why uh, a book with my title, I don't have to be embarrassed if I end up making lots of mistakes. But there is a story, there is a trajectory that I want to follow. And what I'm going to do is hit a few highlights. And the highlights, what I want to do is I want to use the story of Western epistemology to understand why is Western epistemology so relevant to real world epistemological issues. And then we're going to go look deeper and we're going to say, and why is it that Western epistemology so often ends up in what I'm going to call pathologies? And that's not very kind to people who actually hold these positions. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to explain why it is that they're pathologies, because they're smart people who end up getting trapped by the presuppositions of what the answer should be to their questions. And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to identify those presuppositions and then find a different pathway. Now, just a second here, I'm going to, oh, here we go. Okay. And so, and what makes this book timely is that we are living through an epistemological crisis, as President Obama called it. And I'm just going to remind you of a few aspects of it. Climate change, right? That we have uh, huge differences in this country between those who accept the science of climate change and those who are climate change denialists. We have just an unbelievable number of conspiracy theories on social media. Probably the most outrageous is QAnon, but there are so many you can't keep count of them. And then the one that's most recent is the one which is tearing this country apart. Is that who would have thought that you could have perhaps 40% of the population believe that the presidential election, the result was due to fraud, when there is zero evidence of it? And of course, a tsunami of overtly racist, sexist, anti-Semitic social messaging, and there's of course lots of other um, prejudiced and biased messaging, but uh, that those are some of the main categories. And then what I call fascist epistemology. And fascist epistemology is not limited to fascist governments, but certainly the Nazis were a good illustration of it. And it's an epistemology of alt truth and alt facts. Why has Western epistemology had so little useful to say about real world epistemological questions? Now, you may be thinking, oh, but wait a minute. Western epistemology has a lot to say about them. I'm going to come back in a minute and I'm going to give you an indication of what I see as some of the problems. But I start with a trigger warning. The history of Western epistemology can be shocking. So get ready, folks. Um, I'm not doing the whole history of Western epistemology. I'm going to focus on a part of the history of Western epistemology. And in that part is a history of interconnected intellectual pathologies. And here's the thing. Most of the people here today are philosophy students or have been philosophy students in one way or another. And so they've actually been socialized into philosophy. And when you get socialized into philosophy, things that would strike an ordinary person as totally shocking, indeed, many of the things are literally insane, you become accustomed to. And you don't even blink an eye when you find epistemologies making these kinds of claims. The pathologies that I'm going to talk about were not the product of bad people. They were a product of a kind of intellectual blindness, undoubtedly exacerbated by hubris. My goal is not to beat a dead horse, nor even some live ones. But what I want to do is I want to focus on problems in Western epistemology to use them as clues for a more adequate epistemology. And at the end, I will give a brief overview of my positive program. What does Western epistemology have to say about climate change? Do human greenhouse emissions cause the Earth's warming? Well, most of you have probably studied Hume's epistemology, and so you know Hume doesn't even think human beings can have the concept of cause. But in any case, he thinks that there's no non-question begging way of having any beliefs about the future. There's no rational belief about the future. Now, if you know about his view, he knows that we can be accustomed to certain things, but still, I'm just asking about rational belief right now, and that's my main topic. And the answer is no rational belief about any of it. And then, and by the way, I give some examples. I'm only give a few examples, but really, you know, I could pile them on. There are more, and I try to limit my examples to really highly regarded philosophers, so that it's not like I'm just seeking them out. They're there staring us in the face. What about climate change and Quine? Well, Quine famously said, any statement can be held true, come what may, if we make drastic enough adjustments elsewhere in the system. And of course, what that means is that when you take climate science, he's saying somebody could just deny climate change, fix that, hold it true, come what may, and make adjustments in other things. And so what you can see is either the climate denialist would get great aid and comfort from Hume and Quine and others. Why? And then we have the conspiracy theories on social media like QAnon. Well, the original conspiracy theory is Descartes' evil genius. And you know, Descartes' evil genius has total control of your perceptions, so that they're feeding you all the perceptions that make you think that you're living in, you know, a world. You look around you right now, and if you're like me, you see chairs and tables and so on, but none of it's there. And it was really Descartes that was updated in the Matrix trilogy. And here's the amazing thing. There's no general agreement in Western epistemology about why it's not rational to believe that conspiracy theory. And of course, the racist, sexist, anti-Semitic social messaging. Well, here, this is one of the sad facts about Western epistemology is that Mary Wollstonecraft, in Vindication of the Rights of Women, was talking about a very important epistemological problem. The epistemological problem was that not only men, but women themselves misunderstood themselves because of a social system that trained them to think that they were a certain kind of, limited being. And in that book, she said, she had a section called authors who treat women as objects of pity, if not contempt. And who was the first person that she talked about there? It was Rousseau. You may know Rousseau wrote the most influential book in philosophy of education ever written, called Emile, and it's the story of the education of a young man. And after Rousseau has spent most of the book telling you about the ideal education of the young man, he says, Emile needs a mate. What about her? Sophie, what am I going to have education for her? Well, you know it's not going to turn out well when he says, women's main role is to serve men's pleasure. And so how much education is appropriate for Sophie? Not very much. Just enough that she can have sufficient admiration for her husband. Now, this is huge. This is half the species is being raised in a way that gives them a completely false consciousness about themselves. And it doesn't mean that they don't have some insight to that it's false, but still, it's it comes as a huge eye-opening experience, which I suspect most of the women in this room have gone through it. And certainly the people from my generation, when they had the consciousness raising, the shared discovery of, you mean we are the products of a conservative effort to present us as inferior, of less worth, and of less capability? Well, and then there's Du Bois, and Du Bois actually gave the term for this. It's double consciousness. When you see yourself as yourself, but you also see yourself through the eyes, in this case, of the oppressor. Okay, well, these are, Wollstonecraft was, in the late 18th century, Du Bois in the early 20th century. Neither one of them could have gotten a job in epistemology professor in a philosophy department, even though what they were talking about is extremely important epistemological issues. And the topics that they were raising didn't really get seriously raised in philosophy departments until finally they started to be open to women and members of marginal groups. Okay, what about the fascist epistemology of alt truth and alt facts? Surely at least philosophy can help us with that, right? Think of all the philosophers who've argued that facts are social constructions, or have argued for replacing truth with something else, just getting rid of it. Postmodernists, deconstructionists, pragmatists. It's huge. Those philosophies are music for someone who's advocating a fascist epistemology. And I'll just mention one more, Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein actually gave up on rational belief completely. He gave up on philosophy. And instead, how do we solve questions about what's rational? For Wittgenstein, we just go along with our group and our form of life. And of course, a fascist is advocating a fascist form of life. They would love that epistemology. And one more, which is another just sad one, but it's actually going to start to show us a clue to where the problem's coming from. Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies, a really important work of social epistemology. He actually wrote it during the Second World War as a defense of open societies against Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. And Stalinist Russia is not regarded as a fascist country, but they have the same kind of epistemology, which I call a fascist epistemology. And Popper points out, well, this is not new. Plato had a fascist epistemology to a fascist republic. And it's true. You think, oh, no, it's not, but they totally controlled thought. Philosophy and literature would not be allowed in Plato's republic, except as approved by the government. In contrast, Popper argued for societies open to rational criticism. He called this, his views, critical rationalism. And then he gets to the point later in his career when, the question occurs, can he give a rational defense of his critical rationalism? Here's what he says. My rationalism is not dogmatic. I fully admit that I cannot rationally prove it. Or to put it another way, my rationalism is not self-contained, but rests on an irrational faith in the attitude of reasonableness. Do you see? This is someone who's doing really important work in social epistemology. And at the end of the day, he's saying there's no more rational defense for my view than there is for Nazism or Stalinism. And so now I ask, why did he say prove? Remember, he said, there's no way, I admit I cannot rationally prove it. And that's the clue that we're going to take back to see why it is that Western epistemology so often ends in a position which basically says, the best you can do is, well, all views are equally rational. Look at Socrates. Socrates, one of the heroes of Western epistemology. And did he say his advantage was over other Athenians? The other Athenians think they know something, but I know that I don't know anything. That's a pretty minor advantage. When you read the dialogues, he has a lot of advantages. The only reason is he's blind to them. He's not able to understand what his own rationality is. Why is that? Why are they blind to what rationality is? Do I hold Western epistemology responsible for these widespread irrationalities? No, not at all. But why is so much of Western epistemology useless for helping to explain why they are irrational? Even worse, and I won't really have time to do this today, but we might do in the discussion if you want. Why does so much Western epistemology provide an epistemological framework in which it'd be easy to show that at least some forms of these irrationalities that I've listed earlier can be rational, and often the most clearly irrational forms? And so I mentioned here some movements in epistemology. I think probably the most popular movement in epistemology in America is Bayesian epistemology, and subjective Bayesian epistemology is the most popular variant of that. And subjective Bayesian epistemologists, their theory of rational belief or degrees of belief places certain probabilistic, logical and probabilistic constraints on rational belief. And that's it. And then what it's rational for you to believe is going to depend on what probabilities you start with. And there are practically no constraints on those at all, except the probability laws. And that means any of the views that I just talked about, any of the conspiracy theories, any of the fascist epistemology, you could design a probability assignment according to which they would all be rational. Why? Why is it? Okay, I'm asking why. And now to answer that question, I want to go back to the beginning of epistemology in the epistemological Garden of Eden. And we're going to do Western epistemology, but because that's the one that I know. In the epistemological Garden of Eden, no one realizes that they have ever made a mistake, right? You can see it's just like the absence of original sin. Epistemology begins with the discovery that one has made a mistake. And now, with dire consequences for the history of Western epistemology, what was the reaction to that discovery? In Western epistemology, this discovery generated an intense emotional reaction of first shame and then anxiety. Shame at having made a mistake, and anxiety that I might make another one. Error was epistemic original sin. At the beginning, Western epistemology was defined by the anxious question, how can I guarantee that I avoid making a mistake? And this led to the discovery of the proof paradigm for knowledge and epistemically rational belief. And the proof paradigm is something that comes in many, many different manifestations. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little about its development, and then I'm going to pick out 5 presuppositions, which I think individually, you don't need all of them together, individually, each one of them has done real harm to Western epistemology. Starts with the discovery of mathematical proofs in ancient Greece. You can actually prove things in mathematics. Most people have had some exposure to proofs in geometry in a high school geometry class, which can be traced back to Euclid's Elements. But Parmenides actually gave a purely deductive proof in philosophy, and his proof was to prove that reality is one and unchanging. But it doesn't matter what it is he proved right now. It's a model for reasoning in philosophy. Plato's Academy, over the doors was a quote, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." And in the Meno, Socrates elicits from a slave boy a proof of a special case of the Pythagorean theorem to illustrate his epistemology of the forms. Okay. So there it is, right at the beginning. This is giving us the idea. And as a matter of fact, Socrates in every one of the dialogues is looking for definitions. Why? Because he has to have a definition if he's going to then start doing some kind of deductive reasoning. But Aristotle brings the proof paradigm to its fullest form with his discovery of syllogistic logic. And we now use syllogism for a certain kind of argument. But for Aristotle, syllogism just meant deductively valid. He was going to give us all of the deductively valid forms of argument, deductive inference. Those are the inferences that are guaranteed to yield true conclusions when applied to true premises. Aristotle's model of the syllogism had only been slightly augmented in the 2,000 years from Aristotle to Kant, so that Kant was able to argue that for all practical purposes, Aristotle had completed logic. And then all you needed for proof was the first premises, right? Something to start with, to apply the logic to. And they had to be infallible. Okay, again, I'm just going to very briefly. So for Plato, these were definitions provided by our knowledge of the forms. And as I say, it was a great frustration to Socrates that in order to have any knowledge at all, you had to have definitions. And yet, in almost all the dialogues, what he finds is that for really important terms, he has no adequate definition. Aristotle had his own distinctive account of the sources of premises for scientific knowledge, but they're both fitting this model of the proof paradigm. Now, I want to make a note here, and this is to remind you, I'm not doing all of Western epistemology. There are other things that were not so much dead ends. And one of them is Aristotle's account of dialectical reasoning. He not only provided the model for proof, but he also studied dialectical reasoning. So this makes him the intellectual godfather of the two most important kinds of reasoning identified in Western epistemology: deductive inference and equilibrium reasoning. And equilibrium reasoning is something I'm going to come back to later. And so what are the 5 presuppositions of the proof paradigm for rational belief? Infallibilism. All rational belief is infallible. Do you see? If I start off with that, now that one's going to be given up by a lot of people, but I start off with that, then basically it's a challenge to find irrational beliefs. And so you can understand why Descartes was so thrilled. You know, people, they say, what's Descartes' most famous statement? I'm thinking, therefore I am. Now, someone who's not a philosopher would be totally puzzled by that. Why would a philosopher think that was an important discovery? But if rational belief has to be infallible, they're few and far between. Deductivism, laws of logic, or laws of rational reasoning. And of course, there's just so much evidence of this assumption playing its role in the history of philosophy. For example, Baruch Spinoza, when he wrote his Ethics, he wrote it in exactly the same format as Euclid's Elements, because he thought that's what you needed to do to present a rational argument in philosophy. Inferentialism. All laws of rational reasoning are inferential in the sense that they are unidirectional and monotonic. Unidirectional just means that the support flows from the premises to the conclusion. It flows downhill. And monotonic is that they only add beliefs. They never subtract beliefs. And of course, the laws of deductive inference are classic examples of inferential laws like this. All they do is add beliefs. They don't subtract beliefs. But here's the amazing thing. When philosophers started identifying other kinds of rules of reasoning, they were so influenced by the deductive model that even the names show that they were thinking of them on that model, because they called them induction and abduction and inference to the best explanation, all rules of inference. Shortly, I'm going to briefly explain why I think there are no inferences at all. None of the laws that govern rational reasoning are inferential. There are lots of particular instances of reasoning that look like inferences. Why? Because they just add beliefs. But the laws governing them always have more options than adding beliefs. And what's rational to do depends on the circumstances in that situation. Well, of course, inferences also need first premises. So this is not a completely separate presupposition, but it turns out to be important, because even if you give up the inferentialist presupposition, still the need for first premises seems absolutely essential. And the first premises are beliefs that do not depend on other beliefs for their rational support. And this should be familiar to all of you because anybody who's taken a philosophy class, almost always by the end of taking one philosophy class, they've learned how to bring any conversation to a halt. And the method is always this way. Somebody makes some kind of assertion, and you may start off asking what reason they have for that, but really, just to get it over with, put the other person out of their pain very quickly, just ask them what their first premises are. And then ask what reasons they have for those. Philosophy student talking to a friend says to the friend, "What are you doing tonight?" The friend says, "I'm having dinner with my parents." The philosophy student says, "How do you know they're your parents?" The friend says, "Well, they told me they're my parents and I've lived with them all my life." Philosophy student, "Do you remember your birth?" Friend, "No." And by the end, the friend is saying, "Well, I may not have any good reason for believing them my parents, but I trust them," right? And that immediately reminds you again of Popper. I just have faith. Western epistemology always leads people ultimately to be saying, well, I just have to have faith. But that doesn't distinguish any position from any other. Certainly none of them turns out to be more rational than any other. And the final one is first person access. I'm not going to say too much about it here. I say a lot more in my book. It just means that we can actually sort of by look inside, we can figure out what makes our beliefs rational when they are. Okay. Very few philosophers today anyway accept all 5 presuppositions, but historically many of them have. But even one of these presuppositions can have a large distorting effect on an epistemology. And even philosophers who reject all 5 of them often manifest distorting effects that have infected their thinking by intellectual osmosis from the proof paradigm. It's very hard to get outside of the proof paradigm. And now, actually, what I want to talk about is 3 pathologies that we find in Western epistemology due to the proof paradigm. I'm going to just explain them very briefly. I'm not going to worry about because I'm going to then give you some examples. Self-refuting views. Everything that I say is false. That's self-refuting, obviously, because if it's true, it's false. Okay, so in other words, it's internally inconsistent, or if you understand it, it's internally inconsistent. Then we have self-undermining view. Self-undermining views are views, if you understand them, you see that they can't be rationally held. It can never be rational to believe a universal generalization. Well, for those of you who haven't had a logic course, let me tell you, that statement can never be rational to believe a universal generalization is a universal generalization. So you can't rationally believe it. And then we have explanation and pairing framework substitutions. And this is the most diabolical of all, and the one that is in a way the most invisible. And so I'll say something about it, but it's a big topic. But a simple example of it, so everybody will recognize it, is phenomenalism. Phenomenalism is philosophers give up on being able to have rational beliefs about physical objects, about anything in the external world. And I'm saying, you get an education in philosophy and you get used to this. As a matter of fact, I'm no historian of philosophy, but I'm amazed that, say, if I go back to the 19th century, the number of epistemologists who took it for granted that the only rational position was phenomenalism, which is you don't believe in physical objects, you just believe in your own perceptions. And of course, that goes back to Berkeley's idealism and Hume. I'm going to say something about Hume in a minute. And why do I say the explanation in pairing framework substitutions? Well, look, I'm looking over at a table right here in my room now. And my belief that there's a table there gives me expectations for what I will see if I walk around the table or just reach around it and feel it. Just reach out and touch it even. Because the fact that it's a table explains those other perceptions. But if I'm a phenomenalist, all there is perceptions There's no reason for me to expect any particular kind of perception. And what do you mean, walk around a perception? You can't walk around a perception. So if I do what I'm describing as walking around the table, I have no basis for any expectation about what I will see. In Bertrand Russell's autobiography, he tells the story of when he and G.E. Moore, were they undergraduates? They were pretty young anyway. And of course, they had just from their philosophy professors, they had become phenomenalists. And then one day they decided, let's just pretend there really are physical objects. And you should read the description. It's just like all of a sudden, he says, the world was full of color and all sorts of things, and it's just like it was transformative. But here's what puzzles me. What puzzles me is there are all these people who just assumed that rationality required them to be phenomenalists and assumed that they were phenomenalists. But if they had really been phenomenalists, Russell would have said, one day, my perception of Moore and I agreed that we would just believe in physical objects. And then when we did it for the first time, my friend was really there. It wasn't just a perception of him, of me, not just of him, but a perception in me. All these people were phenomenalists. How in the world could you continue living your life if you really believed not that other people existed, but they were just impressions in your mind? That's why I say it's shocking. Okay, so epistemic pathologies in Hume. Actually, there are so many epistemic pathologies in Hume that I couldn't even begin to list them all in 1 hour, or to explain them all anyway. But I want to give you some examples because people are so used to them. First of all, self-refuting. His philosophy is self-refuting. Well, Hume holds that it's impossible for human beings to have the concept of a cause. You tell me how you can have that belief without having the concept of a cause. Self-refuting. Number 2, all of our ideas are derived from our impressions, and we have an idea of the past. We have to have an idea of the past on for Hume because his whole account depends on our being able to recognize regularities from the past. But if all our ideas are derived from impressions, our impressions are always current impressions. Even a memory impression is a current memory impression. So how in the world could we ever get an idea of the past? If we can't have an idea of the past, Hume's complete epistemology collapses. But far from collapsing, Hume's impact on Western epistemology is probably the greatest of any philosopher who ever lived. And I'm going to say something more about that shortly. Okay, how about self-undermining? Hume holds that statements about the past can never provide a non-question begging reason to believe statements about the future, and all of our ideas are derived from our impressions. But presumably when he says all of our ideas are derived from our impressions, he means all of our past ideas and all of our future ideas. But we can never have any rational reason for believing anything about the future, even what our future ideas will be. So on Hume's view, he should say, we have no idea what kinds of ideas we'll have in the future. And explanation impairing framework substitutions. Well, I've already mentioned phenomenalism, and that plays a huge role in Hume's epistemology. The replacement of what he calls bodies with a framework based on impressions. And of course, that comes, as I said, from Berkeley. And I'm going to say something about Berkeley in a minute, too. Yeah, so why am I picking on Hume? He's one of the most influential movements in American philosophy of the 20th century was logical positivism. Logical positivism was grounded in a Humean epistemology. Logical positivism is self-undermining in a way that Hume's epistemology is also. Now, I'm not going to be able to explain that to you now, but it certainly, without a doubt, it was an updating of Hume's epistemology. One of the most influential movements in epistemology today, naturalized epistemology, takes Hume as its founder. Naturalistic epistemology is self-undermining the way that Hume's epistemology is also. Again, you have to take that as to be explained. Okay, here we go. In 2009, David Bourget and David Chalmers conducted a survey in English of 3,226 philosophy faculty and students, including 931 targeted faculty who received special invitations to participate. When the targeted faculty were asked to name the non-living philosopher with whom they most identify, the top vote getter by a substantial margin was Hume. When all 3,226 respondents were asked whether they had a Humean or a non-Humean position on the laws of nature, 24.7% of all respondents and 45.9% of those who specialize in philosophy of science endorsed a Humean view. That is one according to which laws of nature is a misnomer because they are simply reports of regularities with no causal or any other kind of necessity. So Hume's epistemology is still very much alive in the 21st century. Now, I'm going to skip over what I call Berkeley's puzzle, which is really important, and we may come back to it in the discussion or not, but it's a separate topic that we don't have to address in order to tell the story that I want to tell today. And the story I want to tell today is I want to say, let's go back to the beginning, to the epistemological Garden of Eden. And let's consider another path that epistemology might have taken. Suppose that when people discovered that they had made a mistake, instead of reacting with shame and anxiety, they had responded with wonder and curiosity. What a remarkable ability we have to correct our own mistakes, fallibly, of course. How are we able to do it? Instead of building an epistemology based on proof, they would have focused on what I'll call mistake correcting reasoning. Instead of focusing on inferential reasoning, which is monotonic, it only can add beliefs. You could never explain mistake correcting reasoning in terms of monotonic rules because you have, in a mistake correcting reasoning, you subtract beliefs. They would have focused on reasoning that can subtract beliefs as well as add beliefs, non-monotonic reasoning. But I'm here, take a little sidebar here. The proof paradigm has even corrupted our understanding of mistake correcting reasoning. I'd be a millionaire if I had $1 for everyone who refers to a very common kind of mistake correcting reasoning as a reductio. When someone, philosopher, they say, philosopher X offered a reductio of Y's position. And what they mean is that philosopher X derived a contradiction from Y's prediction. But a reductio ad absurdum is a form of inference. It can only add beliefs, not subtract them. What happens when you derive a contradiction from another person's position and they only have inferential rules of reasoning? They end up accepting the contradiction. And if those of you know the story of Russell's famous letter to Frege, it shows us that even in logic and mathematics, reasoning is not inferential. You have to be able to correct mistakes because Russell sent Frege a letter in which he derived a contradiction from axioms that Frege thought were analytically true, absolutely certainly true. If Frege had reasoned inferentially, he would have just accepted the contradiction. Well, of course, then he would have had to believe everything else by his own system. A contradiction implies everything, but he didn't. He did a kind of reasoning that cannot be understood inferentially. The same kind of a problem arises for the common observation that is made about mistake correcting reasoning that says one person's modus ponens and another person's modus tollens. See, those of you philosophers here, you've heard this many, many times. But modus ponens and modus tollens are both rules of inference. They can only add beliefs, not subtract them. And so they can't actually be a form of mistake correcting reasoning. The two most important varieties of mistake-correcting reasoning in epistemology are defeater reasoning. These are the models that we now have in Western epistemology. Defeater reasoning can be used to classify kinds of mistake-correcting reasoning, but cannot adequately explain it. Even in the simplest case of defeater reasoning, in which a belief that P is defeated by a new belief that Q, within a defeater framework, there is no explanation of why Q defeated P rather than P defeated Q. The person starts off believing P. Why doesn't P just defeat Q? And the other one is, I've already mentioned Bayesian epistemology. And here, Bayesian epistemology is quite technical subject, so I'm not going to go into it today. But I'm going to give you a list here of 6 kinds of mistake correcting that Bayesianism cannot explain. And the reason that it can't explain it is Bayesianism is really, when you look at it, about the minimal modification that you need to make the proof paradigm apply not to beliefs, but to degrees of belief. In Bayesianism, all reasoning is inferential. And it has these consequences, which are a result of that structure that it inherits from the proof paradigm. So now, what's my alternative? Rationality is what it is that makes someone a good learner. It is not primarily a logical ability. It involves sensitivity to clues, imagination to envision new or surprising explanations of clues, and the ability to evaluate alternative explanations by how good or bad they are. One important indication of how good a learner someone is comes from how able they are to correct their own mistakes. Okay, in contrast to the proof paradigm, the model that I'm going to propose, and as I say, it's sort of a teaser, you'll have to read the book to get the actual model, but it's fallibilist. It does not require certainty about anything. It can explain how it could be rational not to be certain of anything, not even this statement. I actually propose a metacognitive expected relative frequency principle. It's I call it the Murph principle. It's a principle of rationality. And it explains why, given our evidence, it is not rational to assign probability of truth greater than 1/2 to any substantive epistemological principle, including it. It is almost surely the first epistemological principle that says, given our evidence, we should not be very confident of it. Well, not very confident of its truth, because truth is a hard thing to do with, in science and in epistemology. But I believe the principle is true enough to enable us to explain a lot of epistemology, even though it would be the height of hubris for me to think even that there are no ways to improve it. Anti-deductivist, and as you can see, I'm just going through the 5 presuppositions proof paradigm and denying every one of them. Laws of logic are not principles of rationality. The principles of rationality explain rational changes in one's laws of logic. And actually in the book, I give examples of rational changes in one's laws of logic. Anti-inferentialist. The model of reasoning is holist, equilibrium reasoning. This is a development of suggestions from Quine, Goodman, and Rawls. But I have a more extreme view. On my view, there are no inferences in the classical sense, that is unidirectional and monotonic. At the most fundamental level, all reasoning is governed by principles that allow for subtracting as well as adding beliefs. No first premises. Relations of rational support are multidirectional, so all beliefs or degrees of confidence can and do receive as well as supply support. Now, if you just listen to that description, those of you who know epistemology would say it sounds like a coherence theory, and there have been many criticisms of Rawls as it's a coherence theory of some kind or another, because experience, but this is not a coherence theory because experience, not propositions about experience, is a rational constraint on belief and degrees of confidence. And it still sounds as though that there's a deep, deep problem with it, which I'm going to just mention before closing, but we maybe want to talk about it a little more later. And it's anti-access internalist. Rationality of belief can depend on motivation. Beliefs caused or sustained by a desire to believe them, even if they are not true. Or this is my model actually of a racist and sexist belief and lots of others. Even though an agent has no first-person access to biasing desires of this kind. So these biasing desires make our beliefs irrational by actually, sorry for that, by actually biasing our cognitive processing. And so this is not like implicit bias, which is a really hot topic now. Implicit bias is, in a way, it's kind of accidental. It just depends on what your exposure has been. This is actually a biasing desire, but the bias is not conscious. You couldn't consciously, I mean, I hope you could, maybe somebody can. You couldn't consciously say, I want to bias my cognitive processing in favor of believing what, you know, I desire to believe regardless of whether it's true. Okay. I'm going to, I just very briefly, we're getting close to the end here. Whenever anybody gives you a skeptical argument, the argument's going to have starting points, explicit beliefs and presuppositions. There's going to be reasoning, and there's going to be a skeptical conclusion. And now, even without having read my book, I'm going to show you that you don't have to accept the conclusion. Given any such argument, rationality requires us to judge which of the following makes more sense. Rejecting one or more of the starting points, rejecting the belief that the starting points rationally support the skeptical conclusion, or accepting the skeptical conclusion. And somehow in the history of Western epistemology, the understanding of rational belief became so distorted that people had no trouble accepting skeptical conclusions, even though the conclusions themselves were insane. As a matter of fact, if we had more time, this would be a time when we would have a breakout room, and you would go to a breakout room, and what I would say to you is, come back to the whole group with the examples of the craziest, most insane conclusions that well-known epistemologists have reached and defended and are still even defended today. I already gave you the example of phenomenalism. And you see what happens then is you see, I'm giving you this alternative picture of rationality. And when I tell you the story, along the way, we discover something important. The standards of epistemic rationality are metaphysically necessary. And that seems so counterintuitive that if I just end right here, you would say, man, I'll never buy that book. And really, there's nothing I can say. You can't help. You have to read the book in order to have to be able to see how I could end up in such a position that seems very implausible. But I'm going to say something briefly about it. When you see the discoveries human beings have made of the emergence of life that took place billions of years ago, of galaxies billions of light years away, of elementary particles much smaller than the wavelength of visible light, etc., it seems almost miraculous that a blind evolutionary process could have produced such beings. But when you study human beings, you find that their reasoning is driven by a variety of heuristics and cognitive biases that make it seem all too evident that a blind evolutionary process produced them. Evolutionary naturalists have no difficulty explaining human heuristics and biases, but they have no remotely plausible explanation of how such beings could have made the scientific discoveries they have made, except that we just got lucky. We need a better explanation of the seemingly unreasonable effectiveness of human reasoning, one that does not involve any miracles. Here is one. That evolution made human beings good enough learners on local matters that greatly affected their survival to make their reasoning in particular cases and their judgments in particular cases not, I emphasize, not their generalizations like what makes a belief rational, their epistemological theories were completely off base, but their reasoning, in a reasoning case, they're just deciding like, well, in this case, given this evidence, what does it make more sense to believe, A or B? Or they don't even make it explicit. They just get certain evidence and they believe A rather than B. That's what I'm talking about. So it's particular epistemic judgments, particular cases. And what I'm going to say is that reasoning was probabilistically sensitive, a term that I explain in the book, to evidence relations that hold in every domain, local and non-local, and in every possible world. In spite of their many cognitive limitations, over time, these good enough learners were able to form communities of inquiry that enabled to extend their discoveries from local relations between past and future observations to events in every corner of the universe, from the largest galleries to the smallest subatomic particles. What we have is metaphysically necessary truth without Platonism. For those of you who don't know what Platonism is, Plato thought we had this kind of intellectual insight into the definitions, the generalizations. But I'm saying we have no insight into the generalizations. What we do have is judgments about particular cases. And then it's the judgments that on reflection are regarded as rational. Okay, no direct rational insight in the content of the fundamental principles of epistemic rationality. But our judgments about what it is rational to believe in particular cases, or our reasoning that lead us to modify our beliefs in particular cases, is probabilistically sensitive to those fundamental principles. What does that mean? It just means this. The principles, when you add to the principles facts about our situation, suppose we decide it makes more sense to believe A than B, the principles themselves imply that. This kind of probabilistic sensitivity is compatible with completely misunderstanding of the nature of the fundamental principles themselves. And that's, of course, history, largely the history of Western epistemology is that misunderstanding. And of course, it's not going to be every particular judgment, because I've already mentioned there are going to be lots of cases where the person is motivated by a desire to believe that P, regardless of whether it's true, like to believe that the white race is superior to all other races. When there's that kind of motivation, the reasoning is not probabilistically sensitive to these principles. It's driven instead by their motivations. And the explanation for why it's not rational is just that. The rationality of our beliefs in every area of inquiry, including in science and epistemology, depends on our reasoning in particular cases and our judgment about what it is rational to believe in particular cases, being probabilistically sensitive to the requirements of the fundamental principles of epistemic rationality. Even the evolutionary naturalist belief in evolution is rationally undermined if their reasoning in support of evolutionary theory is not probabilistically sensitive to fundamental principles of epistemic rationality. The example of Brian the Creationist, maybe we'll talk about Brian the Creationist in the discussion, because now, and then a big challenge that I have to face is the X-Fi challenge, that this whole method of cases, which is what I'm relying on, is just my own very parochial biases, or ours together. Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to now, when we go back to the real world, I can draw some conclusions, but I'll do that later. So what I'll do right now is I will say, let's call this to a close, and we'll take a break and come back for questions.
So thank you, Bill. That was wonderful. Part of me would have been happy to let you go on for a while, but we still have a lot of time. So I'll suggest that we break for about 5 minutes, and we'll come back and people can ask questions, and people might invite you to share more of the presentation that you had prepared. So let's set your clocks, and we'll come back in about 5 minutes and then resume our discussion. Thank you. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks. Okay, hi, Jamie.
Hello. Maybe I'll give people another minute to come back.
Sure.
That was great.
Okay, well, we'll see what people have to say.
We'll see if it's great or not. What are your premises?
Really?
And your inferences that follow from those premises leads you to the conclusion that it was great.
Yeah, but I don't reason that way. You know, what's fascinating to me, actually, on the first premises, when I go to Europe, in Europe, it's not just philosophy majors who take philosophy courses. Students take philosophy courses in high school. And so in every academic discipline, they are just ready to say, they listen to what are your first premises? And what they're going to do is it's going to be the gotcha moment, right? Because once they've identified your first premises, you're going to have to say, well, I just take these on faith. I mean, what can I say? They're the first premises. And so they don't believe me when I tell them, no, but I don't reason top down like that. I mean, I do reason top down, but I don't go from first premises that don't get support from anything else. And,
well, Bill?
Yes.
But deductive reasoning from premises is extremely useful. It's just that you have to recognize that those premises may need to be changed.
Oh, that's right. Oh, yeah, that's right. I have, but all I'm saying is you can do deductions from premises, but reasoning itself is more complicated than that, because even if you think all you're doing is a deduction, there are really all sorts of rational possibilities other than accepting the conclusion. And that's what you're saying. And one of them is change one of the, I just call them the starting points, because in an equilibrium picture of reasoning, there aren't any first premises. But yeah, that's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, if you think about reasoning in science or reasoning in philosophy, it's explanatory reasoning. Explanatory reasoning, there are lots of different kinds, but one kind is where you try to formulate principles that would explain, whatever it is, in this case, for me, particular judgments. But the reasoning is still going in the opposite direction. It's the explanation that provides support for the principles, generally speaking. Of course, it goes both ways.
Good.
So,
okay, so I'm going to let Jamie, who wants to manage the questions, because I'm not going to be able to do that.
Right. So, so hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back. We're going to officially start the Q&A session. I think I'm going to, Michael Ball Blakely, if you're there, I might ask you to speak to us and give us instructions about how to use the raised hand function. I think that's the most efficient way for people to be identified.
Yeah, sure. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see breakout rooms and reactions. If you click on reaction at the very bottom of the menu that pops up, you'll see raise hand. Click on that and you'll be added to the queue, and Jamie will be able to call on you for your questions.
Great, thanks. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand function, and then I'll see that you have a question and I will call on you. And then I think I will ask you to unmute yourself, obviously, and also to, I think, enable your video. So let's see. I see some raised hands already. Okay. I see Jose and Cody and Colin. Oh, great. And great, a bunch of them. All right. So I'll start with Cody Doubt. Cody, do you want to unmute yourself and your video?
Yeah, you didn't have to start with me. Okay, so I'm thinking about what you're saying in terms of, moral corruption. And I really thank Steve for giving me the vocabulary to really like deal with moral corruption, because I used to say stuff like, I can see why in revolutions they always come after academics second after they go after the aristocracy. Anyway, but so what I wonder is, and I have no reason to doubt what you're saying. In fact, I believe you, right? I think this is really, really, really good, right? But in a lot of ways, like so what I deal with is the ways in which people appeal to fallibility and victimhood and stuff to shield themselves from their own moral corruption, right? And so a lot of what you're saying is that, people don't have the tools to not be morally corrupt, or corrupt in other ways, probably too, to begin with. And I'm not sure. I don't think you were at my talk that the undergraduates put on, but like part of my thesis is that, well, power short circuits people from coming to the right conclusions, the outlandish conclusions that you were talking about, right? Because that's what it would take. Like a lot of the times, like the right conclusion based on like the experience of people who know better, who are outside of, having to shield themselves from how their participation in, massive amounts of suffering all over the world, right? And I worried that, and my thing is that I worried that, well, if power can short circuit it when it comes to like taking somebody as an authority who understands like something that perhaps the person in power actually cares about, can what you're proposing as the fixes for these issues in epistemic reasoning actually come to further shield someone from their moral corruption? If I'm correct that they probably don't have, the tools or maybe the access because of the power relationship they have with people who do have the access to the outlandish conclusion. Does it make sense, Bill?
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to address everything that you've asked here about moral corruption, but let me say some things about what I want to do. Is I want to focus on the epistemology, and then you see there's separate questions about what's the political solution to it or something like that, which are much, more. I think there's a lot that we would need to talk about, which we couldn't really quite do here. But remember, I was talking about the example of Wollstonecraft and W.B. Du Bois, and about the ways, what they both draw attention to, the ways in which that members of the oppressed group are strongly motivated to reinforce the stereotypical understanding of them, according to which they're in a position that they deserve to be in. And actually in the book, what I say is that any society, in order for it to be stable, it has to have a legitimization narrative. And the legitimization narrative is the narrative that explains why it is, well, that you might say these are inequalities or something like that, but they're all perfectly justified. And that legitimization narrative, and particularly the people in power, but it's a very broad category of people. I mean, for example, white males get tremendous benefit from that legitimization narrative. And that means that they tend to have, and I'm not talking about everybody here, I don't generalize, I want to look at particular cases, but they tend to have a strong motivation to believe the legitimization narrative, regardless of whether it's true. Or the way I say is to believe it even if it's not true. And for me, that's a technical term that's defined in decision theory. And here I'm going to give it to you briefly so you can see it's sort of an interesting idea. In an ordinary situation, when you're thinking about, well, what are the alternatives about, say a belief that P, and I mean, my belief might be that, white males are superior to these other groups. Well, the alternatives are, I believe that P and P is true. Now, for the members of these powerful groups, that's the top ranked alternative. I believe it and it's true. But the interesting question is, what about the other alternatives? And in this case, it's often the case that the number 2 ranked alternative, the number 2 preferred alternative is, well, I believe it and it's not true. And if you say, or people generally believe it. Why? Because, well, the best one is I believe it is true, but even if it's not true, if people generally believe it, I still get the benefits, right? And then there's the 2 other alternatives are I don't believe it and it's not true, and I don't believe it and it is true. We won't worry about those right now because the 2 top ranked ones are driving the whole analysis. But notice this is very different from the kind of situation where that we're often in, where say I'm driving a car, and then I have, and the question is, and this really happened to me, so I can really bring back the memory. When I put my foot on the brake, I wondered, do I have maybe a small fluid leak in my brake lines? Now, let's look at the alternatives here. Now, do I have, let's let P be, I don't have a brake fluid leak. The top ranked alternative for me is P is true and I believe it's true, right? I don't have a brake leak and I don't believe that I have a brake leak. But here, it is not anywhere near the top, the alternative where P is false and I believe it's true. Because if P is false, my life is at risk. And so for me, the second ranked alternative there was, if P is false, then I believe that it's not true. In other words, I want to, if my brake line, my brake fluid is leaking, I want to believe that it's leaking. That's what so I kept testing it to see. And you know what I found out? It was leaking, okay? And so those 2 different kinds of situations are the crucial kind that I'm talking about. And you can use decision theoretic analysis to explain why in the one case, a person would be motivated, if they could do it, and this is really interesting, to bias their belief in favor of believing P, even if it's not true. And that's the case of the one who has the privilege. And in the other case, they're not motivated at all to bias the belief, their cognitive processing in favor of the belief that I believe that my brake fluid is not leaking, and that belief is not true because it really is leaking, okay? So that's why, to me, this kind of analysis, there's more we can go to, but this kind of analysis actually just opens the door to understanding why these oppressive systems can be extremely resilient. Because then and of course, in the past, I used to have to just give historical examples, but we've now seen it in the United States, how these beliefs can spread on the basis of zero evidence because they play this really, important other kinds of roles. Not the truth doesn't matter. What matters is that if enough people believe them, then I benefit from them. Now, that doesn't directly answer your question, but what I tried to do is I tried to give it the epistemological spin that would enable it to connect up with what I'm doing here. And then maybe you and I sometime could go on and discuss the further ramifications of the question. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds fine. I just worry if if somebody is really dead set on maintaining their power in light of their moral corruption, if they could retreat to a situation where they no longer have that propositional form of racism, you know what I mean? And like if they had at least had the tools to remove that proposition, but like their position of power keeps them from yeah, anyway, yeah, okay, yeah, I think, yeah, we should talk about it later. I really want to talk about this later. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right, Bill. Thanks, Bill.
Great. Well, thank you. So I see four more people in the queue. So I think, let me just say, call on you. I think I'll call on Jeremy Steger first, then Jose Mendoza, then Colin Marshall, and then Ricky Sproul. So be to ask a question.
Hi, Jamie. Sorry, you were cutting out a bit at the end. I think I wanted to ask a question that I think is going to end up being pretty similar to Cody's question, except maybe coming at it from a different angle. And it was just that I felt like you raised a problem at the beginning of the talk that I didn't feel like I quite saw the resolution to at the end. And this was the idea that a lot of these positions in Western philosophy are I'm going to put it, and hopefully this isn't doing damage to your view, but they're ripe for abuse, right?
Yeah.
So let's just taking the example of Quineanism that you brought up, which I wanted to take because I like Quineanism, and I think you like Quineanism too, if I was following correctly. Like Quineanism is a powerful tool if you apply it to the right kinds of problems, like asking whether or not the Newtonian law of gravity should be an inverse r squared or an inverse r to the 2.01 law or something like this, right? And it's a tool that can put you in deep trouble if you want to use it to answer a question like, should we believe that greenhouse gases are increasing the temperature of the planet or something like this? So, point taken, right? But I took it that part of what your project is intending to do is provide a foundation that is less susceptible to abuse. But I was wondering, maybe, I guess the first question is that in fact what you're aiming to do? And the second question would be, could you speak a little bit more about how your framework helps to do that?
Okay, notice you said to provide a foundation less susceptible to abuse. And of course, foundationalism is exactly one of the kind of presuppositions that I'm concerned about. But what I see what you're saying is I would translate that into a framework. And one thing about philosophical frameworks is all philosophical frameworks are subject to abuse. You can abuse any kind of intellectual product, but what I'm thinking is that the problems that I'm looking at most seriously are the ones where it's not an abuse of the framework. I mean, it's just you just apply it, and it says yes. I said Bayesianism. Yeah, here if you have this kind of as a matter of fact, a paranoid schizophrenic could probably be an ideal Bayesian because I don't know if you know paranoid schizophrenics, but a lot of them are extremely smart. They have extreme logical acumen. So they might, somebody might say, well, give me an example of a rational Bayesian. And you can say, well, here, look at this paranoid schizophrenic. And I'm just saying, that's not an abuse of the framework. You can say, well, the framework gets used for other things. It's just to say maybe the framework, well, don't apply it there. But what I'm really puzzled about is, why are there so many of the frameworks don't apply to these important epistemological questions? Now, it's true, whatever framework I come up with will not apply to some also, but at least it'll also apply to some. And here's another one, a really important question. Remember I said, consider the example of Brian the Creationist, and maybe we'll talk about Brian the Creationist in the discussion. Let's talk about Brian the Creationist. Brian is actually very knowledgeable about the evidence for evolutionary theory, but he believes that God produced all that evidence to mislead people who place too much reliance on human thinking and not enough reliance on God. And so he believes that, it's all a big conspiracy. In other words, God is a conspiracist. He's conspired to give us all the evidence. And the evidence, of course, is evidence that goes back, it's evidence that concerns, takes us back to hypotheses about what happened billions of years ago, what happens at the submolecular level, so on. All those things go into it to work out the evolutionary story and the evolutionary mechanism.
I'm just taking Child's aspirin.
Somebody's saying. So anyway, so now we ask the question, is it rational, given all the evidence, consider all the evidence there is in favor of evolutionary theory, and remember, I just look at two things, like the evidence between the choice between Brian's version of creationism and some version of evolutionary theory, where everything I always say is, we don't actually say, we take it to be literally true, what we say, but it's more rational to accept one rather than the other. We just have this two options, and what's more rational, choose one rather than the other. And I say, now, it sounds very mysterious when I explain it abstractly, but when I get down into, actual situations, my view is, well, the evidence itself, in other words, God could definitely make it so the evidence rationally supported something that was false. God could easily do that. And Brian is actually proposing that that's what God has done. This is my way of looking at it. Whereas Brian is saying, no, actually, once you look at it in the right way, the rational response to the evidence, is to reject evolutionary theory. And then I say, I expect that people, when they look at a question like this, they can recognize that although God could have made it true that creationism was true, God could not have made it true that the evidence supports creationism. This evidence. He could have given us different evidence that did, but he couldn't have made it this evidence supports creationism. And that's where I go from saying, whatever these fundamental principles are, they're metaphysically necessary. They're true in all possible worlds. If God can't change them, they're obviously metaphysically necessary. But then there's one further twist to the story. And the twist of the story is this, and this comes in for evolutionary naturalists. Evolutionary naturalists who make what's rational to believe dependent on evolution. That's not all of them, but it's a lot of them. And they look at it and they say, well, fortunately, evolutionists favored belief in evolutionary theory based on our evidence rather than the other. And I say, slow down, don't be so sure. Brian and other creationists are a growing segment of the world population. We have good reason to believe that they have more children than people who believe in evolutionary theory. So we could actually be part of an evolutionary process that is leading to the conclusion that ultimately everyone on Earth will believe that the evidence that we have supports creationism rather than evolutionary theory. And so if evolution, if somehow what's rational belief depends on evolution, then you and I are mistaken right now when we say, oh, it's the evidence supports evolution over creationism. We just don't know where evolution is going. But I think, again, and I don't want to, it's not that I want to insist that you reach this conclusion. Now, the whole point of the book is to get people thinking, just to get people thinking, that you can think about it and you can see, no, evolution itself could not make that rational to believe. It could make it, very beneficial to believe it, particularly if, I'll tell you the story of how evolution gets to this process, gets to this end state. It gets to the end state by finally the creationists take over the governments all around the world and they execute anyone who believes in evolutionary theory. Well, you can see that believing in evolutionary theory does not have survival value in that world. But all I'm saying is it may not have survival value, but it's still true that that evidence supports evolutionary theory over creationism. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Can I ask a quick follow-up, or should
Sure.
we move on?
Yeah.
Well, we do have a lot of people in the queue, but go ahead if it's quick. Yeah.
I'm worried it might be not quick enough. So I'll just jump back to the end of the queue.
I'll move
but
on.
yes,
All right, thank you.
Bill, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 4 people because we have Russ Hansen has joined the queue. So I will ask Jose Mendoza to ask a question.
So I'll ask really briefly, and go ahead and maybe piggyback this, Bill. Thank you for the talk. I found this very fascinating and very interesting. Piggyback this on probably what Colin's going to say. I suspect it's going to be somewhat similar. But basically, all I'm asking is if you could go over that slide that you passed over at the end, because you started to do this already, but I'm kind of curious to see how this plays back with fascist epistemology, because the way you framed the question originally was this is the epistemological crisis. In a lot of the examples you gave, to me, seemed to be actually political crises kind of dressed up as reasonable disagreement, or metaphysical crises dressed up as kind of reasonable disagreement. So things like climate change, I think what motivates that is a certain political stance. Yes, the conspiracy theories, and so it's these are beliefs that to me don't seem to be beliefs that go across the spectrum. So to me, that would seem to be like an epistemological crisis, in the sense that no matter what your political orientation is, you have conflict over these things. To me, these conflicts seem to fall on certain political lines. Whether or not you wear a mask, right? That became a thing, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Whether you believe the facts about gun violence tends to put you Democrat or Republican. Climate change, Democrat, Republican. But we don't seem to have these for other things, like wearing seat belts, what the temperature is outside, whether condoms lead you to have less sexually transmitted diseases, right? So there are all these things that have not been politicized. The things that are not politicized don't have an epistemological crisis. It tends to be the things that are politicized. So I'm wondering if it's a political crisis. And like I said, I get the feeling that Colin's going to probably ask something similar in a more coherent manner. So maybe we can piggyback a couple of these questions.
So Bill, are you okay if we let Colin ask his question too?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Okay, Colin, you want to go ahead?
Sure, and yeah, thanks for teeing me up, Jose. So yeah, I think this is sort of similar, but if not, Jose should say so that you answer his question first. So I was thinking of, so Schopenhauer has this criticism of Kant, which is Kant tries to use rationality as this tool to rule out all moral failings. So everyone who gets, has a defective moral character is failing rationally. And Schopenhauer's response is, don't ask, that's not rationality's job. Rationality doesn't rule out certain motivations over others. It's something else, and he's got his theory. So likewise, and this is why I think it's in line with Jose's, why I think that it's the job of a theory of rationality to condemn these views, as opposed to, say, a theory of truth, right? Like, what's wrong with the conspiracy theorists? The central problem is that they believe false stuff. And then, we could say there's political problems on top of that. Yeah, so that's the question. Why put this on rationality?
Okay.
And by the way, I really like the view. Sorry, I should have said that first.
Oh, sure. Can you all see me now? Because I can't see me, so I'm wondering.
We can see you great.
Okay, I'm gonna go back to the slide that Jose was talking about. So I'm going to share my screen now. And I'm talking about here a racist, sexist belief, and the question coming from both directions, from Colin and Jose, is that, well, aren't you just pointing out political problems and expecting epistemology to solve them, and or rationality. And you see, and for me, Colin, it can't. I mean, if you just say truth solves the problem, I don't see how that is even a starter, because anybody who's going to make an appeal to truth is going to have to say why it is that they think that their side is true and not the other. In other words, a direct appeal to truth is just not something human beings can do. God might be able to do it, but not human beings. And I appreciate these questions, because what I want, it's really important for me to be successful. I'm going to see if I can do it in seeing that these are definitely political problems, but that epistemology is actually relevant to understanding what's going on. And it doesn't by itself solve the problem. As a matter of fact, here's a safe prediction, because it happens all the time. Suppose I were running for president, and I ran for president, and I said, we have a serious epistemological problem here. And the problem is that some people are resistant to evidence because they have desires to believe that P, regardless of whether P is true. Well, the next day, my opponent could get up and say, Bill Talbott is running for president, and notice he puts out all these things like climate change. But now what we can see, I'm going to explain to you today why his belief in climate change is really based on belief, desires to believe that P, regardless of whether it's true. See, that's a kind of direct claim, just like Colin. Oh, it's true. I claim one thing is true. You claim the other thing is true. And you don't solve problems that way. But it's what I'm trying to do is to actually show that what might have been thought to be moral problems or political problems have an important epistemological aspect. And the important epistemological aspect just here is that we can understand how these, for example, legitimization narratives make a society stable and how they're motivated. And then once we understand that, we understand why it's not rational to believe something on the basis of that kind of cognitive biasing, because it's a kind of biasing that actually doesn't care about whether the belief is true. We can look at it, see, by understanding it, we see this is actually cognitive processing that doesn't care about whether or not it's true. It just has the goal of believing that P. And that gives us, I hope, you see, into a way of, it's just understanding that I'm looking for here, of understanding on the one hand just how deeply resilient these things can be, but also how we can make them unstable. But the making them unstable doesn't just come by saying, well, you say P and I say not P. What you say is false and what I say is true. It has to be a different approach. And my criticism of Western epistemology is not that it hasn't solved all these problems. My criticism is I can take these epistemologies and I can use them to justify a fascist epistemology or a patriarchal epistemology. They actually fit it. And of course,
we'll follow up. So the point, Bill, is but yours would not.
No, in other words, it's a deep political problem. What's the best way to bring about political change in light of this? But I think it's actually really important to understand that it's an epistemological problem and it requires an epistemological solution. And so, I mean, and then, but you see, okay, so that was racist, sexist belief. That was the desire to believe something even if it's not true. But then what about the conspiracy theories? I mean, it's really quite amazing how many theories of rationality you can take. A paradigmatic example of it would be a paranoid schizophrenic. And so what I say, okay, why? I mean, look, and again, those I have to, by necessity, refer to things that some people here won't be familiar with, but they're sort of just the bywords in Western epistemology. Think of Goodman's blue-green, Grubline problem, where, well, we have evidence that all emeralds are green, and we also have the same evidence equally supports all evidence are GRU, which means green before, and now we have to change the year, green before the year 2050 and blue afterwards. And that's a beautiful example to show the failure of almost all the inductive logics that were being developed at the time. But Goodman didn't stop there. He couldn't find a solution to it. He could not find a solution to it. And the only solution ultimately he could find was not even a normative solution at all. But we would be insane if there weren't some rational basis for believing that all emeralds are green that distinguished that belief from all emeralds are GRU. So also in my book, I talk about that too, in terms of parasitic hypotheses and so on. That's not something that I can really have to, the notion of a parasitic hypothesis or parasitic theory comes from Gilbert Harman. And it actually can be used very quickly to just open up to make people, oh, aha, oh, I see. So there's something important differently between these various different hypotheses. But this is, we're talking about contemporary epistemology. They're still, I would say most epistemologists would say there is no solution to the Grubline problem. If there's no solution to the Grubline problem, except we just go, let's do Wittgenstein. We just fit in with our crowd, go on and do the way our crowd does. That's not a rational solution. That's giving up on a rational solution. Does that help?
Yes, Bill, thank you. And thanks again for this. This was a very enjoyable talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Hi. So I see 3 people in the queue. Maybe if it's okay, I'll take 2 questions together. Is that okay, Bill? And then
I guess so, because we're getting towards the end.
Yeah.
It helps if there are 2 that are connected the way Collins and Jose's were.
One at a time and see how we go. So I'm going to call, but people be mindful there are 3 questions. So if we can sort of, in our questions and answers, leave space for that. So next I'll call on Ricky Sproul. Go ahead, Ricky.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Talbott, just want to say great talk. And I agree about, can you shut the door, please? I agree with all the fundamental aspects of your talk. I'll say why in a second. But my question was more about, when I think epistemology, I'm thinking kind of Kant, and he kind of jumps in the same place. He's disturbed by some of Hume's conclusions, I think. And that kind of coincides with these antinomies, which deal with cause and effect and that sort of thing. So in your view, how well does the Kantian mind frame kind of lead to some of the same problems you're trying to address, where he has these 4 antinomies when it talks about theoretical reason, thought to be more about epistemology. He has one for each moment. The practical has an antinomy, and the aesthetic has an antinomy, and it seems like he's identifying these same problems in with human reason, and he hopes to kind of create this overarching system that might address all of these different aspects where reason goes wrong. So how does your and I think you're fundamentally right about a lot of things there. But what I like about it is it seems more formal, kind of like Kant's. It's less prescriptive, right? It's not telling us what to do. It's giving us systems of thought to arrive at maybe what we ought to do or that sort of thing.
Okay. So, thank you. That's a good question. And in my book, I actually talk about Kant. Kant, and not only is he responding to Hume, he's also responding to a crisis in metaphysics, where it's a crisis for Platonism. Because people are claiming, oh yeah, I can use my rational insight and see all these truths. and they all contradict each other. And so Kant wants to somehow save what he calls metaphysics, but he's got a problem. He's still stuck in the presuppositions of the proof paradigm. And so his only way out is to say that the only true metaphysical principles are the ones that our own understanding imposes on our cognition, right? And that's the synthetic a priori. And you see, then we don't need to appeal to Plato's forms. It's just, these are the fundamental principles of our cognition. But you see, that's, and again, if I were to have more time, I would say that's to go from Platonism to relativism, to say, well, yeah, you mean that solves the problem, right? Why are we committed to these things? Because they're part of our cognition. But what we know is it's going to fail. He's still looking for some basis for infallibility. And the infallibility is going to be, we impose these on our cognition. But then in the book, in chapter 3, I go through actually some of his analytic propositions and a lot of his synthetic a priori propositions, and they turn out to be false. And so he didn't save metaphysics, or he didn't save, epistemology either. But what he does is he shows us that as long as you're trapped within the presuppositions proof paradigm, you're not going to succeed. And so I hope that helps to clarify. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Ricky. Russell Hanson.
Hi, again, thank you for the talk. It was fantastic. I'll get to the question quickly. So while I was listening to your talk, something that kept coming up to me was that like this mistake correcting process has like a pretty extensive communicative component. And a lot of your examples are examples of someone communicating and trying to work through reasoning processes that have a mistake correcting aspect. So I guess with that in mind, and maybe kind of going back to Jose and Colin's question about the relationship between the epistemological and the political, with communication as sort of the medium, I think of like these epistemological pathologies also as having communication pathologies, but I also wonder like what the prospects are of like trying to resolve these communication and epistemological pathologies in terms of trying to like convince someone to correct their mistake in believing or having internalized the assumptions of the proof paradigm if they already don't accept the mistake correcting, paradigm, right? Like, how do you get them to correct their mistake if they already accept the proof paradigm and they say, well, your view doesn't have like what I look for in views. So what do you think the prospects are for convincing people to accept this view?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. I'm going to do something first, and then I'll come back to the main question, which is that your comment here is a reminder to us that Jürgen Habermas took this process of basically he called it communication theory, right? Discourse, and it's rational discourse, and he socialized it. He said it's the social process that's the ideal of a rational process. And I think that's right. And I'll just say this much about Habermas. Habermas then had to face, well, when you have this process, it's a real world process, but for him, the process that we engage in has to, there's some kind of context transcendence, or he calls it life world transcendence, right? And that puts him in a bind, because the life world transcendence looks like, if you really believed in it, it would have to be metaphysically necessary. And if it's metaphysically necessary, then you have to have some kind of Platonism. You have to be able to see that. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to resist Platonism without going to the metaphysics. And all I'm trying to do is to say is that I understand the motivation to resist Platonism, but if you avoid the metaphysics, then you end up in some kind of, it's a relativist position. Well, for Habermas, ultimately, it's what's inescapable for us. Well, what is inescapable for us? What does that have to do with what's true, So, but I want to give Habermas a lot of credit, and also Rainer Forst, who follows him, is going to the same kind of thing, is they're really struggling with how do we make sense of both immanence and transcendence of this social process. Okay, so now we say, okay, let's go back and we say, yeah, but it's a new paradigm. I call it, the probabilistic sensitivity paradigm for rationality. You don't beat someone up into changing the paradigm. What you do is you depend on them being open enough to see, just to say this, in other words, if I can get people open enough to say, that's an amazing ability we have, how do we correct our mistakes? That just opens up the field. I don't even want to start answering it yet. I just want to open up the field in that way. And then when you open up the field in that way, I think, and in the book, what I do is I say, the history of epistemology and the history of inquiry gives us clues as to what the answer is. Let's follow the clues. And you may find, if you suppose you're reading the book, you'll find me making certain choices in following the clues. And you may say, I think Talbott ignored a more promising direction of following the clues. What I'm encouraging you to do is follow out that direction, see where it goes. Because what I want to do is I want to open things up. It's not like I want to close things down and say, okay, now, once you've read this, you have to agree with me. I just want to open things up. Thanks for that question.
Yeah, that's extremely helpful. Thank you. I look forward to following the clues.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And then we have a question from Elwood Wiggins.
Hi,
Hi,
thank you. I'll echo the thanks for this wonderful talk. It's been very exciting to think about. And I guess my question is, I was wondering if you could maybe put what you're proposing in dialogue with Aristotle's. He talks about there being three kind of different ways of knowing things, three different kinds of epistemology, if we want to call it that. It's from demonstration or apodeictic knowledge, which it sounds like you are saying that kind of Western epistemology fell into the trap of thinking that was the only way to know things, and that led to all of these pathologies. But Aristotle also talks about dialectic and then rhetoric, right? And between kind of these two different models of knowing, and deliberating, I wonder if you could say something about where your framework falls between those two.
Dialectics is the closest to mine because that's a kind of equilibrium. In equilibrium reasoning, everything is open. And so you have, Rawls calls them provisional fixed points. And when he gives examples, his provisional fixed points are usually generalizations like slavery is wrong. But for me, the provisional fixed points are not slavery is wrong. They're judgments about particular cases, like what is it rational to believe? In this case where we have, I gave Brian the creationist, we have this body of evidence, we have two choices. That's right. Which is more rational to believe? So you see the true principles of epistemic rationality, applied to our case, if it's wide open, may say, well, there are alternatives that you people haven't even considered that are more rational than the other alternatives you're considering. Okay, that's nice, but I just want to know, are we at least on the right track? When we favor, one over the other, are we favoring the ones more rational? And my claim is that in certain kinds of circumstances, the answer to that question is yes. And that's what enables us to build and to become more rational and to also increase our understanding of rationality. Well, when Aristotle is describing dialectic, it's very similar to that.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
Well, great. Thank you. I don't see other questions in the queue, and this is the time that we chose to end the session. Bill, are you free to hang out informally afterwards, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, okay. I'd be happy to stick around if anybody else wants to talk.
Okay. So what I'll do now is I'll formally close the session. And I want to thank all of you for attending this event. And above all, I really want to thank Bill Talbott for a wonderful presentation.
And I want to thank everybody for attending too. It's great to see you. Bye.
All right. Thank you again.